Hi everyone and welcome to this live interview. I'm super excited that today we are in collaboration with Time for Geography and presented in partnership with Durham University. And today we are joined live by Dr Sarah Knuth, an associate professor in the Department of Geography from Durham University, and we're going to explore how homeowners can decarbonise their homes, why it's important. So we're going to investigate green technologies and also, which I'm also really interested in talking about, the inequalities that exist in our current system around kind of green technology and energy. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah, and if you wouldn't mind telling us, first of all, what do we mean when we say decarbonisation? What does that mean?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ellie, and great to virtually meet you all, and hopefully see you in Durham sooner or later. But yeah, it's great to be here. So yeah, talking about decarbonization, what do we mean? That's just a little bit more of a jargony word for just saying reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So in everything we're talking about today, remember the kind of overarching legislation that we're thinking about here is the Climate Change Act, so CCA of 2008, and so thinking here, this is the UK's commitment under the Paris Climate Agreement. So all of the kind of requirements that we have to cut emissions. And so, the numbers don't necessarily matter so much for our purposes today, but remembering it's a pretty sizable commitment. It's about 68% by 2030, which is a big deal pledge, a huge deal for the UK to commit to this. It's something we've watched for, including the COP26 summit in Glasgow. So it's a big deal. And then also we're thinking about the government's, also legally binding requirement now to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so I won't go into too much detail there. There's a lot to say, and I think probably other episodes have gotten into that more. But just one thing to remember here, that what we're looking at when we're thinking about decarbonization is we're thinking about a lot of different sectors. So if you're reading the news, and I definitely encourage you to keep doing this on these issues, when we talk about this in the UK, certainly we're thinking of things like the electricity grid and the electric power system. UK is actually usually doing relatively well compared to, for example, the United States. You might be able to tell from my accent, that's where I'm from. But obviously, a ways to go. But we're also thinking about sectors, for example, like home building, so building materials. We're thinking about agriculture. So, what is DEFRA doing? What about the different kinds of things happening around, for example, livestock raising? So it's a lot of different things. But when we're talking about homes, which we'll get into, a lot of what we're typically talking about is going to be energy. So different kinds of energy related greenhouse gas emissions related to the amount of fossil fuels, both in the kind of power grid, what's still left in the power grid, but also all of the other things that come into, especially heating homes. But yeah, so that's the general ballpark we're playing in today.
Fantastic and really good. I think we're going to talk about different scales and kind of that can link to different sectors as you mentioned there. So let's dive into this. What can homeowners actually do to decarbonise their homes, and how would an individual maybe go about decarbonising their homes?
Yeah, and so it's interesting. So for this discussion, we're starting with homeowners, and just to take a little bit of a step back there, recognizing a lot of folks aren't homeowners. A lot of folks will never be homeowners. So sometimes we'll use homeowners very specifically. Other times we might actually say households. And so just kind of starting with households, I think a really important thing to do when we start at this scale is to both emphasize the importance of kind of individual action around climate change. It is really important to think about, the power of personal choices. And certainly there's a lot of things related to homes that we can think about. This kind of idea of fighting climate change starts at home, which, relates to all kinds of things. That's, a lot of household choices, what we consume, how much we consume. So there's a lot going on there. However, a lot of times when I'm talking about this, and especially when I'm talking about this with my students, because I have a lot of students, who typically go towards the, what can I do? What am I doing wrong around climate change? And I usually say, maybe that is not always the most helpful way of thinking about this. A lot of the time, what we're talking about with the housing sector is a lot bigger scale choices. So a lot of times what we talk about is, there's a lot that homeowners can do, but there's a lot that homeowners, have to do in cooperation or kind of, in a lobbying sense, in a kind of political activism sense around larger government choices. And I'll get into like why I think that's so important in a second. But okay, so just overarching caveat there. But what can homeowners do? Okay, so some really important things to think about. So, for example, if someday you buy a home, a lot of this depends on what kind of home one is kind of moving into. So the UK has a big existing housing stock, and we'll get into that. That's going to be most of our conversation today. But what also is important is, sometimes you might be actually moving into new build home housing. So, there is new housing being built. Certainly the government would like to see a lot of new housing getting built. And in that sense, there's actually a lot that's happening with the kind of new housing being built. And so that's things like how are houses being constructed. So typically when we think of things like building materials, green building, it's traditionally known as a harder to decarbonize sector. And what we mean there is things like emissions from concrete or steel. For example, if you live in a high rise, you probably will have these kind of big building materials involved in your home. So that's, there are some kind of choices there. What kind of home are you choosing to move into? And what is actually happening with the kind of new build housing sector. And here is where we really see a lot of action. So this idea of, well, we're not going to actually have gas boilers, or at least traditional gas boilers, allowed in new UK building stock. That is very likely to happen in the next few years. What exactly that will be, some questions about, whether it's going to be kind of new gas boilers or it's kind of hydrogen ready boilers, which we'll talk about in a second. So there's a lot there. However, most folks in the UK are not moving into new housing. Most people are moving into an already built home. And the big thing here is that the UK has some of the oldest housing stock in Europe, basically. And unfortunately, what that means is it has typically had some of the most inefficient, in an energy sense, housing stock in Europe. And that's a lot of different things. It has a lot to do with the kind of relative age of the housing stock means different kinds of technologies were typically used, which don't get replaced in a hurry, right? So if you have a gas boiler, you have an existing natural gas heating system, that's going to have some kind of stickiness. It's hard to kind of change that really quickly. It also means basically just leaks. So a lot of energy that is leaking out of walls, that is leaking out of ceilings. Less so if you actually live in a terrace because there's a built-in efficiency there. But basically, there's a lot of kind of things that could be made better with the existing housing stock. So typically what we think of here, and this is the kind of, the granddaddy or the kind of big solution that solves a lot of problems, is energy efficiency. And so that's basically, if you're an existing homeowner, you have someone come in, do an energy efficiency audit, look at where all the leaks are, and then help you actually increase the efficiency of your home. So that's things like, putting more insulation in your roofs typically, and that's the kind of big one. It's also fixing leaks. Maybe you replace your windows, maybe you replace your doors. It's a lot of different things like that. Can also be all your appliances. So, how's your boiler? Could you have a better, more efficient boiler? So that's, and a lot of times when we're talking about all of the other stuff, and so that is usually things like, putting a solar panel on your home, and especially with a solar panel plus an energy storage system, that would help you get off the grid. Really hard to do that unless you already have done things like efficiency. Basically because you have to put so many more solar panels on your home to actually replace your kind of power grid needs if you have, if you're leaking energy everywhere in the process. Okay, so efficiency is huge. This question of power, a lot of times when we're thinking about how to, get better with our electric power, we have two choices as kind of homeowners and households. And one is to say, well, what are we buying? We're in a consumer choice system in the UK, and we have been for a while. And theoretically, what that means is you do have this option of buying greener electricity from a different supplier. That's very much kind of relying on what they're actually telling you that they're producing. That can come from different sources at the utility scale. So that can be biomass, it can be offshore wind, it can be some onshore wind, big solar panel fields. And some of these sources have more controversy than others. But you could also generate your own power. And that's, again, these solar panel systems, usually in energy storage. And Ellie, please jump in, by the way. I could go off forever on this, but what I do want to do first is the biggest controversy that we're into right now with this is how are we going to decarbonize heat in the UK? This is one of the biggest challenges that we face. So partially what's going on here is, despite some controversies, there's a lot going on in a context of an ongoing energy crisis around, things like, will onshore wind, the existing ban on onshore wind in the UK, will that continue, or will that be reversed? What might happen with this rumbling on maybe we'll bring in new coal, maybe we'll start hydraulic fracturing, which brings in more natural gas, real controversies that come out in a time of energy crisis when energy prices are really high. But generally, this, really important political moment aside, we're doing better with power. What we're not doing so well with is decarbonizing heat. So it's a much bigger challenge. And basically what happens is, most UK homes have natural gas boilers, and there's big natural gas systems, that are producing all of this at scale. So it's harder to actually change that. So as a homeowner, what's typically going on now is folks have the opportunity to get off the gas grid, or more or less get off the gas grid, by installing a ground source or a air source heat pump. So it's basically electrifying this heating system. So it's an electric technology. It's pulling in warmer air, basically either from the ground or the air. So it's a fully electric system. And so it's just consuming electricity, which you either need to buy or produce via solar panel, but you're not on natural gas anymore. The biggest change to the existing infrastructure would be to say, let's do district heating. So I've just come back from Denmark, and this is actually almost exclusively what they do in Danish cities. So this is these big grids where you'll have energy produced at scale. And, traditionally that's been things like natural gas or biomass or waste. But increasingly it's big renewable energy, and that'll power a whole city, for example. So you have these big centralized technologies. The trick is the UK never built these to begin with. And so anytime you have these in UK cities, you have to put them in. So you have to do these you might have seen some of the infrastructural retrofits for electric vehicles. You have to do that, but at an even bigger scale, to actually put these new district heating systems in. It's happening some places. Downtown Manchester is just doing this. So, keep an eye out, but it's a bigger change. But the biggest controversy right now is over hydrogen. And so the important thing to remember here is it is difficult to change these systems quickly. And the sell of hydrogen has been to say, well, you can either put hydrogen in and keep basically your existing boiler, or we mix it with gas and you slowly decarbonize that way. However, it has been a lot more controversial for a lot of different reasons. Basically, folks saying, this isn't actually very efficient. Hydrogen might not be actually produced with green sources. Hydrogen power can be produced with renewable energy or can be produced with fossil energy, and we don't really know which. Is this something that is more expensive, more dangerous, and will actually delay our really getting off natural gas? Is it just keeping business as usual for as long as possible in a way that actually makes it much more difficult to truly get to net zero in the way we need to get to? So I've talked for a while, so I should let Ellie jump in with any clarifications, or we can move on.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I think so many parts that you pulled out was so interesting, and maybe against what maybe people would think initially in terms of decarbonising. And I suppose the hardest thing to decarbonise is usually heating in the UK, because it's based predominantly on gas. Is that the majority, and therefore you can't just easily switch, because it's not electricity, you can't easily switch where it's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, electricity in some ways is so, you're replacing stuff at scale, right? It's like homeowners don't even see that usually, right? It's, yes, they do see it if they're putting solar panels on, but a lot of times electricity switches are happening, offshore, or they're happening in big plants, and it's pretty distant from a lot of people's experience of climate change or kind of decarbonization. Whereas a lot of the stuff with household technologies, are super intimate. They really change, at least your kind of basic home systems. Presumably, then people kind of forget about them after a while anyway. But, at that moment of shift, it's a big deal. It's also very expensive. And this is something that we will kind of move on to in a second, I think, because that's been a lot of the political challenge. Lots of people, I think, willing to do this, interested in doing this, who have so far been barred just because it's too expensive to do all the things that you have to do this stuff.
And I think also, I suppose, if I ask like my students at school, kind of how do you decarbonise homes, they probably would say, "Oh, put some solar panels on your roof." And I think what you were maybe saying is the interesting thing is that it's really about that insulation and keeping your energy and being like as most efficient as you can with like.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is, you often can do all of those things together, right? It's just that it's a lot of this it becomes down to cost, right? If you're putting solar panels on, to actually kind of truly replace the energy that you're using can sometimes be a little more difficult than people think. And that's often where things like insulation come in. And it might be actually helpful to think about, so if we think about, UK greenhouse gas emissions in general, I think housing accounts for about a fifth of that. Usually when we're talking about, housing, why is housing important to climate change? A lot of it is things like heating space. Kind of heating, especially in the US, if I was putting my US hat on for a second, air conditioning is a huge deal in the US in terms of kind of space cooling as well as space heating, but also things like hot water. It's a lot more of this kind of creating comfortable spaces in terms of emissions than you would think. And that's why sometimes, fixing leaks is so important. So in terms of, it certainly matters like how long you play on your Xbox or how long I have my laptop plugged in every night. But in terms of it, a lot of times it is more these kind of big, kind of creating this indoor space question. And so that's why it's so important to, fix the leaky roof than you might think, the stuff you don't see. But you do feel it. It does make a big difference.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think kind of going on from that, you said a fifth of, is it UK emissions are from housing? Was that correct?
Yeah.
And then, and you've also mentioned how sometimes it's not just personal choices, a lot of it is government choices in terms of where our energy comes from as well. So why is it so important to decarbonise at the kind of at our home scale, like that kind of individual scale or family kind of scale? Why is that so important?
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's different ways of answering that. So I think some of it is, there is the sense of, when we're thinking about a big, societal challenge like climate change, the sense that, we're all pulling together, right? That we're all doing our bit. I don't think that we should underestimate the importance of that, that there is, there really needs to be attention here. But I think a lot of the key thing here is that a lot of the things that you would normally do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in housing immediately impact on people's lives in an energy crisis, especially. And so, I just think this is inescapable. All my students talk about it in multiple classes that I have right now. It's, if you're dependent on fossil fuels right now, especially natural gas, or heating again, you are vulnerable to energy crisis, political energy crises like we're in, but you're also vulnerable to price volatility. So, again, putting my US hat on, I'm from Pennsylvania originally. Pennsylvania is a natural gas exporting state. It used to be a coal exporting state, and then hydraulic fracking came in. These huge kind of recent energy booms. And, in certain ways, it was a win for people immediately because they had very, very cheap energy, even though it was really delaying the states getting off greenhouse gases. But also price volatility came in. So anytime you have a moment like this, people could be paying not very much one year, then all of a sudden their bills, climb and skyrocket the next year. And so this is really something we have to think about. And that volatility thing really matters in a place that's exporting energy. More generally, when we think about this in the UK and in Europe in general, we're just talking about fuel poverty. If you're not living, in an immediately kind of energy exporting region, obviously the UK still does from the North Sea, you're highly dependent on these fossil sources. And what that has recently meant is, poverty. So National Energy Action, I think their latest estimate is, I think 6.5 million people in the UK live in energy poverty. That was up from like 4 million a few years ago. I think we could probably find numbers that are even higher. If we're thinking here of, what are the trade-offs between, buying household necessities and heating your house in the winter. And so this is a health crisis too. I mean, this is, there've been some real tragedies around this, around, people dying because they couldn't afford to heat their home, or they were exposed to other things, like respiratory diseases because of mold, which I can testify. I had this problem this year. I was reluctant to keep my thermostat warm enough because I was save money, and my house grew mold. Then I was coughing a lot, which was interesting. This kind of, there's a real kind of pernicious effect here, where it's so simple in so many ways to make people's lives better and also reduce the climate crisis. It's such a win-win for people's lives. I mean, this is actually a lot of what got me into this area of kind of climate change intervention, because it seemed like such a no-brainer, right? And obviously, Ellie and I were just talking about this before we started recording. I just very reluctantly bought an air conditioning unit for my house, because I have a dog, and I have an old dog, and I'm really worried about her if we have another heat wave like we had last summer, hoping I don't have to turn it on. But this is another thing that, if you improve insulation of houses, that will also make homes less vulnerable to heat waves, which again is pretty important in terms of people's comfort, but also just people's safety. So, there's a lot of things that we can do here that actually reduce climate change impacts as well as greenhouse gas emissions. Hugely important in the US too. A lot of the things that I work on in the US version of this are around things like, well, what do we do at the home scale to reduce perhaps wildfire exposure, the kind of risk of wildfire, or hurricane risk exposure? You can actually improve people's roof systems and make them less vulnerable to damage by severe weather at the same time as you're doing all this decarbonization. So there's a lot of things to do that, make people's lives better while kind of climate proofing them in a broad sense. So yeah, but I would just say, I think the other thing, Ellie, it's a really good point, is that, when we're thinking about acting at this scale, again, this is something where the UK government has been involved in a lot of ways in terms of, the housing sector, trying around housing affordability issues, but also kind of, intermittently, unfortunately, there's been a lot of different kind of schemes that basically say, well, if a heat pump costs you £10,000, which it easily can, there will be these different kind of subsidy schemes where the government will come in and aid homeowners in doing this. So it's, but it's basically, it has to be a kind of partnership in a lot of ways between the government and homeowners, because otherwise, it really does present challenges for most people. It becomes too expensive. I would say, I think the final point there is, this is a potential win-win in a different way for the UK economy. And so when I teach my economic geography class, this is something I really emphasize, is that a lot of the rumblings right now around the UK and greenhouse gas emissions, the UK is looking at places like the United States, especially with some of the Biden administration policies last year. There's huge investment happening right now, which is saying, well, we want to lower energy costs, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we also want to build a lot of these industries. We want, the investments in people building new heat pumps to come into the US economy, instead of the UK economy, which is a problem, right? So if we're trying to build, just the basic workforce, so that's, who is doing the energy audits, who is actually installing heat pumps, not that simple. These are technically skilled jobs. They're actually pretty good jobs. But there's also kind of broader investment, broader tech jobs, kind of the new technologies of the future around this stuff. If the UK doesn't act now and doesn't build a mass market by enrolling lots and lots of homeowners in these schemes, there's a real chance that the UK just loses out on this. And other countries, other investors kind of come in and basically create the green economy without us, which is not a thing we want.
I think a lot of themes that you talked about there tie really into our next question, which is what inequalities exist around green technology. You've already mentioned kind of thinking about homeowners versus obviously not a lot of people obviously don't own their homes, and in terms of decarbonisation there, and then also of course like energy poverty with the energy crisis that's going on. So but I know there's kind of a broad range of inequalities across in terms of so many things. So I'm going to let you go because I know that you're very kind of passionate and interested about that as well. So what inequalities exist around green technology?
Yeah, and I think I've said some of this already. I mean, I think one thing just to remember is that when we're thinking about fuel poverty, typically, and I'm drawing a, kind of, broad brush here, but, when we're thinking about who can afford to own a home versus who can't, a lot of the biggest issues with things like energy efficiency has been, yes, energy efficiency is expensive, and a lot of these other home technologies are expensive. And it does matter, how wealthy, how much money do you actually have as a homeowner to, participate in this stuff. So treating that first. Unfortunately, the kind of most well-off homeowners can absolutely jump on this, and it is a huge advantage. And it typically does all kinds of things for you. If you have super energy efficient home, great rating of your home, remembering that we have this, and it's important to look at homes when you buy a home. But you can afford to do that. And if you can afford to do a heat pump, all of this stuff adds value to your home. So those that already have the money to do this stuff typically end up way better off. And additionally, right now, those folks can go off the grid, right? So if energy prices are climbing, the best folks who are theoretically most able to pay the costs of increasing energy costs don't have to, because they've already kind of opted out of that. Whereas homeowners who have less disposable income can't do that. So those are folks who are left, kind of paying their mortgage, paying actually a rising mortgage because inflation has increased, because energy prices have increased. So mortgage costs go up and energy prices go up. So kind of cost-strained homeowners end up kind of hit in double ways. But obviously, when we're talking about renters, those folks don't typically have the same options in terms of doing all these kind of new efficiency improvements or technological shift improvements. They're really left at the mercy of what landlords want to do. And so typically, this has been one of the biggest problems we're talking about housing decarbonization, especially around the stuff that really affects people's lives, is that it's been very difficult to kind of incentivize landlords to do this stuff, because usually they just pass a lot of energy costs on to renters. So it's a huge problem. And this goes alongside all of the other stuff that we might talk about around kind of under maintenance, is a serious problem in the UK, right? If we're thinking about, disrepair, under maintenance, mold problems, energy is one of these things. The other thing I would say is, social housing has been a huge deal in terms of, what kind of social housing is, same kind of questions around kind of under maintenance. If folks remember an interesting action, for those kind of politically active folks, the Insulate Britain actions in 2021 were really focused specifically on social housing and efficiency in social housing, specifically for these reasons, right? Because they're saying, these are the folks who are least able to pay for this stuff. They're the most exposed to some of these issues. And this is, of course, there's a lot of complicated politics around social housing. Some of this has to do with, broader funding and kind of refunding of social housing, a little bit beyond our remit here, but it's all kind of tied up together when we're thinking about these questions. I would just say, I think that, there's a lot of questions, I think, around, how do you best address fuel poverty? And I think a lot of folks who are kind of more into these kind of larger scale, basically systemic changes to the UK housing stock, say, yes, the fuel cap is important, but it doesn't actually do us a lot of long-term good to basically kind of subsidize energy companies to keep energy prices down. Couldn't more of the money actually be going into, these kind of more systemic changes that prevent kind of the next energy crisis to come? So it's really crucially around a lot of these kind of issues of cross-cutting economic inequality, racialized inequality, especially if we're thinking about the U.S. context, absolutely inescapable. And a lot of this stuff ends up mapping on in really difficult ways to climate change vulnerability as well. So if you're thinking about both sides of the problem, again, the folks who are facing basically heat morbidity, so that's heat death, and different kinds of public health crises around climate change. A lot of this is bound up in these existing inequalities. So again, it's getting the kind of the subsidies and the investment and the public investment and the regulation where we need them to actually make people's lives better around climate change and to reduce the worst kind of human costs of it.
Just to say to everybody, if you do have any questions, please do write them in the chat and I'll ask Sarah. And kind of linking, just a kind of question for me before we go on to kind of advice for students as well, or if there's any questions from anybody watching. The one thing you mentioned was in Denmark about kind of decentralizing that energy or doing it at that city scale. I think I've explored with my students the Auckland Islands that I think are doing that within the UK, that are kind of have their kind of renewable energy system. How possible do you think that is with the UK's current infrastructure, or is that just an ideal that would happen, but actually the reality of it is very low?
Yeah, I mean, and so I'd love to run the number. I've never run the numbers on this personally. It's certainly something that we see happening again, at kind of in specific scales and in kind of pilots. So Durham has a really interesting pilot going on around actually old coal mines and basically the kind of mine water can be used for district heating. So this is something you actually see in quite a few coal mining regions. I think there's a possibility to use these kind of existing fossil infrastructures, or infrastructures in the kind of loose term, and repurposing them. So that's definitely something. Certainly, I think it's something you can imagine happening at the scale of central cities that also that kind of already have these complex networked infrastructures. That being quite a lot easier, where it's kind of already dense, there's already a lot happening in the subsurface, maybe too much, and maybe that's some of the difficulty. Where traditionally has been more difficult is rural areas, just because it's more expensive to do. Even places like Denmark that have very high density, even in small towns. You don't typically see it, in the kind of, I think, the most isolated rural areas. Small towns, though, I think if you can kind of muster the investment, it certainly is possible. And remembering, these systems aren't that old. These are kind of, 20th century investments. So it's a lot of it has to do with kind of political will and the amount that the public, it does have to be, I think, a government source here is willing to invest in this. So yeah, I think it remains to be seen. It's not like any of these decarbonization of homes options are cheap. And that is the main, I think, takeaway from this. I just said, I think a sample cost, 10,000 pounds a heat pump, perhaps. Hydrogen is usually estimated to be many times that right now. The latest studies that I have seen have been that this is pretty expensive. In a lot of ways that was kind of said, touted as the kind of cheapest option because you wouldn't have to replace the existing grid. But, again, I think there's a lot of questions about that right now. But yeah, and I think there is that question of kind of what can we do with existing gas grids as well. But I would say, I think the next person, I'd love to get a district heating specialist on here to kind of talk about that in more detail, because I think it's a fascinating question for the UK.
If this might not be possible to answer, but if there was one change that you could make today or tomorrow in terms of our homes and energy, what would it be?
Oh, I think my heart, because I do love the kind of grand vision of public investment, would be just refund some of those really promising UK schemes. The UK has this tradition of really being an inspiring leader on climate action, but then, in I think recent years, there's also been this real tendency to kind of have great ideas and then not execute them fully. So some of these kind of home grants for energy efficiency, for heat pumps too, are right on the money. I think it's exactly what should happen, but they need sustained political attention. They can't just be kind of there for 2 years and then go away, or go there for 5 years and go away. And they really have to be scaled at the size of the need that homeowners have. So just more money for homeowners, and of course social housing as well. At least there's actually ways to write this in for landlords. I've been looking at some whole home retrofit stuff in the U.S. that is really promising on small scale landlords, maybe with very specific you can't raise your rent rules, where you have to be very cautious about raising your rent. Grants for them as well. So it's that kind of scale of investment that doesn't have to be all the time. It's a one-time investment at scale, I think, that would solve so many problems instead of kind of drib-drabbing and then taking back as soon as you actually see homeowners participating. Because it's also what we need to build the workforce, right? You want people to say, this is a great job to go into, and I actually have the confidence that I can train for this, I can go into this, I can build a business, I can invest in this, and it's not going to go away in 2 years, and I think we really just need that.
Fantastic.
So yeah, more money.
And that kind of links fantastically into our kind of last question that we ask all guests, which is, how did you get to where you are today? I know you actually started doing earth sciences as a degree, and then what advice would you give students? In a lot of our students who maybe watch this are either GCSEs or A levels taking their next steps. What advice would you give?
I'm going to show my age here, but I originally started at uni in 2000 in the US. And I knew I wanted to work on climate change. I wanted to be a climate activist, but without really having a language for that at that point. It was quite a while ago on these issues. And so the kind of nearest choice that I could think of was basically to be a climatologist. And there were a lot of IPCC authors who went to the school or were teaching at the school I went to. And so I said, this is what I can do. This is the closest option I have. But what's really happened, I think, in broader society, but also in the academy, is that we have all these different options now for engaging with climate change that aren't just, be a scientist and raise a lot of warnings about why we need to take action now. Because I was starting to find that really frustrating and saying, I actually want to talk about politics. I want to talk about poverty and injustice and, and all of the reasons to do climate action now. And so, fortunately for me, kind of human geography has evolved with me as a discipline, and which is why I very happily kind of found my way there eventually over time. But I love geography, and so first advice, please think about geography. We'd love to see you at Durham, but we would love to see you in lots of really good geography departments engaging these questions here. I think there's so many different ways to actually make a real contribution. And this is something that really comes up with my students a lot right now. We were just talking about some of the kind of unanswered questions that I have around district heating in the UK. Same thing goes for a lot of this stuff. The questions around hydrogen, for example, energy storage. There are all of these incredibly important intellectual problems that they're just sitting there. They're sitting there waiting for students to do amazing dissertations or kind of original research on as an undergraduate that could be, the best research that anyone has done on this issue because they're brand new issues. And so it's a really exciting opportunity to kind of put your academic hat on and make a real difference in some of the political issues you might care about. We have a lot of really exciting political movements in the UK right now. It's a really great place for it. But I would just make a pitch. We need a lot of academics too. We need a lot of people doing the kind of research that might be unpopular, that might be critical, that is not necessarily going to be funded, for example, by a fossil fuel company. There's just always a need for that. And so, there's a lot of space for you to do really good work. So, come join the fight in that sense.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think we covered so much themes, more than just keeping your house warm and slapping a solar panel on. So lots to digest and lots of different examples which students can take home and really think about, and particularly the chats around inequality as well. So thank you so much for being a guest on this live interview with Time for Geography and the Curious Geographer.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm just going to pass it on to everybody just to say our final goodbye, and that if you check out the Time for Geography website, there's some shorter kind of in like curious videos, which are kind of 5 minutes about our live interviews, like on some key topics. So definitely check that out. There are some already up there, and there will be more. For example, this interview will turn into a nice little 5-minute video as well, great for teachers and students. So I'll leave that with you, and have a lovely rest of your week. Good luck if you're doing exams, and enjoy half term if you're on half term.